us laugh, some of us groan. Ugh. But work's just a fact of life. We all have jobs, and we have a lot of different kinds of jobs. Might drive a truck, might drive a tractor, might work behind a desk, we might work building desks. We all have different things that we have to do in order for society to continue to function the way that it does. Jobs are necessary, but there are some jobs, personally, I think, are less necessary than others. For example, these are real help wanted ads in real newspapers that came across that I thought I'd share with you, kind of illustrate my point. One of them comes from Oakview, California. It said, "Wanted someone to go back in time with me. I've only done this once before. Safety not guaranteed. Must supply your own weapons." Here's the real kicker. "Get paid when we get back." Yeah. I'm not real sure assistant time traveler is a need that needs to be filled in today's society. Here's another one. It comes out of London. Real help wanted ad in a real London newspaper. It said, "Wanted nemesis. I am 5'10", into kayaking. That's where you hike and you kayak at the same time. Kayaking, hiking, conversation by day, justice, honor, and vengeance by night. Looking for arch nemesis, megalomaniac, or crime lord considered. If interested, call 020-634-7475. I'm not sure the supervillain is a job that we need filled in today's day and age. I think we got enough of those running around. There are some jobs that are not necessary. I really thought you guys would have more fun with that. I thought it was hysterical, but that's okay. It's a lot of work up here trying to get you guys to come along with me on this ride. We all have jobs that are necessary. And they're not just necessary for society to function. They're necessary practically, too, for our own lives, because we have bills to pay. We have mouths to feed. We have things that we need to do and accomplish in our jobs, or how we get the means in our hands and in our bank accounts to do that. Jobs are necessary. But sometimes we get frustrated with our jobs. And we might ask, why am I doing this? Why do I give so much of my time to this career, to this job, to this task every single week? We work a lot in the United States, by the way. I mean, the 40-hour work week is kind of an antiquated idea. 86% of men and 67% of women all work above 40 hours a week on average. All right, that's a lot of time. We work 137 hours more than our Japanese counterparts per year. We work 260 hours more than our British counterpart per year. And on average, we work a whopping 499 hours more per year per individual than French laborers. The last one's not really a surprise, though, is it? When was the last time you saw something said made in France? Never, because they don't work. That's a joke. Kind of. We work a lot. In fact, if you were to start working at age 18, and you were to work till you were 65, retiring then, you were to work 50 weeks a year, taking 2 weeks vacation, only 40 hours a week, so kind of this ideal, mythical scenario. If that's what you worked, you would still work 33% of your waking hours during the best 47 years of your life. That's a huge chunk of our lives that we're giving to a job, to our labor, and to our work. And we have to ask the question, why? Why do we do this? That's why we started this series today called Thank God It's Monday. A lot of times we have this idea that thank God it's Friday, I don't have to be here anymore, I get to start the weekend, I get to start my life, I get to have some fun. But what if we could have the opposite mentality? What if when Monday came, we said, man, I am so glad it's Monday. I get to go do the thing that God put me on earth to do. I get to fulfill the purpose that He's called me to fulfill, and I get to do it through this job that I put in 40, 50, 60 hours a week at. That would be revolutionary in our lives, wouldn't it? And that's a possibility. We can say, thank God it's Monday. And so we're starting that series today. Throughout this series, we're going to be talking about things like, what is the purpose of work? How did God design it? And how did He design us in that context? We're going to be talking about the relationship between work and our worship, because there actually is a strong correlation there. And then we're going to finish this series off by talking about just some practical insights and wisdoms that God has given us on how to find blessing in our work and how to find that satisfaction in our labors. But today we're starting off with a question that maybe you've asked yourself before, maybe you haven't. What does God have to do with my work? Does He even care about what I do Monday through Friday when I punch that clock? Now again, some of you have asked that question before, but maybe this is, for some of you, the first time you've ever stopped to consider that God might be interested in what we do with our jobs. For us at the church, myself, the church staff, we get to kind of cheat at that question. It's easy for us to answer. Yeah, God has a lot to do with our job. We work at a church. But what if you don't work at a church? What if you work in a school, or you work in a restaurant, or you work in a factory? What if you work at an automotive dealer? What does God have to do with your work? To help us answer that question, we're going to be looking this morning in kind of an unusual place in the Bible. We're going to be looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. It's in the Old Testament. It goes Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Sometimes it's a little tricky to find, so as some of you are turning there in your Bibles, if you're getting frustrated or having a hard time with it, feel free to follow along on the screens to the sides, or personally, I would recommend you download the FCC Monmouth app on your mobile device. Click the Sunday button, and you'll find sermon notes there with the passages already pulled up that we're going to use this morning, ready for you to use and to roll with. So before we dive into this, we need to understand a little bit about this unusual book, Ecclesiastes. Because if we don't preface it with come to it with a certain mindset, we're going to walk away saying, what in the world is this doing in the Bible? This is so pessimistic. This is so negative. Why would God give us this? We need to understand what this book is. Ecclesiastes deals with life under the sun. That's a phrase that shows up again and again and again throughout this book, life under the sun. And we need to understand what that means, okay? Because we kind of take for granted today the fact that the earth is round, that it revolves around the sun. Like we as kids, we see that on Sesame Street or whatever, and we're like, yeah, of course, everybody understands that's the way the universe works. But there was a time in human history when we didn't know that. Actually, not that long ago. There was a long time of human history where people believed that the earth was flat, that it had a solid dome over the top of it, that there were two lights that moved across the sky called the sun and the moon. On top of that solid dome was this big cosmic ocean. If you've ever read the creation story in the book of Genesis, there's this phrase that shows up. It's the waters below and the waters above. And some of us may have said, what's that all about? That's what it's talking about, that big cosmic sea. And on top of that sea was heaven, where God lived. And so you had kind of this divided universe. And there was life above the sun, where God lived in heaven with the angels. And then there was life under the sun, where you and I live. And when Ecclesiastes talks about life under the sun, it's talking about our everyday practical lives, the things that we do every day. We get up, we go to work, we do our 8 to 10, we come home, we do our chores, we eat dinner, we get up and do the same thing again the next day. That is life under the sun. And there's nothing wrong with that, really, because honestly, we don't have any other choice. But here's where the danger lies, both for these ancient people and for us today. Sometimes that separation can become just a little too stark and a little too pronounced, and we can begin living as if there is only life under the sun. And we can almost start living in this practical atheism where we say, yep, God exists, but he's all the way up there and I'm all the way down here, and he has no interest in what I do in the ins and the outs of my Monday through Saturday, which just isn't the case. But Ecclesiastes, it starts to investigate that line of thinking. What is life separated from God? What is life under the sun, where I don't really include him in the practical parts of my life, and things like my work, for instance? And that's where our passage picks up in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Because if we remove God from the equation and we're just living life under the sun, and my job is just something that God's not interested in, I have to have some reason, some purpose for my labors. So we start trying to fill this gap, and sometimes we try to fill it with stuff. And we start to think maybe my job is really just about acquisition. It becomes a method of attaining and acquiring things. Is that going to be satisfactory in my career and in my life? Ecclesiastes investigates. Look at chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 17. It says, so I hated life. You see how it already gets off on a negative foot. It says, so I hated life because the work that's done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. And yet they'll have control over all the fruit of my toil into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. And this too is meaningless. So he asks this question, is stuff a good enough reason to keep getting up on Monday and going to work? He says, no. There's a problem here, a fundamental problem. And he discovers it a little before our passage, actually. I'm going to reference stuff in the rest of this book. We're not going to read all of Ecclesiastes, though. But he discovers earlier in this book that death is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter how much stuff you have or how little you have. It doesn't matter how powerful you are, how powerless you are. We all go in the dirt. And you might be buried next to each other. Death is the great equalizer. And so he looks at that and he says, I could spend my whole life acquiring things. I could amass great fortunes and it would amount to nothing because you can't take it with you. You couldn't back then, you still can't today. You can't take it with you. There are people that have tried, but they failed miserably. You take the ancient Egyptians, for instance. We've all seen the pyramids in Egypt, right? They're one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Inside those pyramids was a tomb. It's where they buried these great and powerful pharaohs. They mummified them, put them in sarcophagi, and then they put treasure, and they put food, and they put clothing. They put all of these vast riches in this tomb with the pharaoh because the thought was when they go to the afterlife, they can take it with them. They'll need those fortunes and that food. Millennia later, we open up those pyramids, and guess what we find? All that stuff is still there. You can't take it with you, folks. You never have been able to. We never will be able to. So to work all of our lives, to pour all of our energies and our times and some of the best years of our existence into a job just so that we can acquire more stuff is ultimately kind of fruitless and meaningless. But you might be saying, wait. I could be generous to my heirs. I could leave an inheritance. I could leave a gift for my children. That's a good thing, right? Yeah, unless your kids are idiots. That's essentially what the passage says. You don't know if your heirs are going to be wise or if they're going to be fools. And if they're fools, they will squander every penny that you have labored for with all of your effort and all of your skill, and it will still amount to nothing. I have a family member who had to learn a lesson a hard way. He married a real sweet girl, and who unfortunately her mother had passed away a few months before their wedding of breast cancer. A few weeks after their wedding, unexpectedly, her father passed away. Just a terrible thing. But this young couple, they received an inheritance. And it wasn't a vast fortune, but for a newlywed couple, it was a huge blessing. At least it could have been. But a large portion of it was spent foolishly on silly things, like a motorized bar stool. Nobody needs that. And then it came time to pay taxes on that inheritance. And there were a lot of questions like, we got to pay taxes on that? It was a hard lesson. They're doing much, much better today. They've learned that. They're doing great. But it was a hard lesson to learn. And it's just another example. You don't know what's going to happen to all that stuff you've labored for and worked for your entire life. Maybe it will be a blessing. Or maybe it'll all get flushed down the toilet and you will have wasted all of that time and effort and energy. It's ultimately kind of pointless. And the point gets emphasized a little bit more as we keep reading. Look at verse 20. He says, so my heart began to despair all of my toilsome labor. Let me just pause there. Previously, he was really frustrated with all of his stuff. He's like, this is dumb. I can't take this stuff with me. Now he's starting to bemoan the work itself because it seems empty. My heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom and knowledge and skill, and then they must leave all that they own to another who has not toiled for it. And this too is meaningless and a great misfortune. Work doesn't have a lot of purpose if we're only working for acquisition and things and stuff. Because again, you can't take it with you. And if you leave it to someone else who knows what they're going to do with it, it's a frustrating, empty endeavor. Now, I want to remind you, okay, all of this is from the perspective of somebody who has removed God from the equation. He has no interest in my work. He has nothing to do with my labors. It's completely separate and divorced from him. That's the mentality here. And that may be a mentality that some of us can resonate with pretty easily because maybe we're asking the same question. What does God have to do with my job? You know, I don't work as a priest. I don't work as a clergy. I'm not an evangelist or a missionary. You know, I serve in a restaurant. I work in a bank. I work in a hospital. I build things. Like, what does God have to do with my job? The answer is a lot. And we're going to see that in a minute. But when we remove him from that equation, we've got to fill that void with something else. And acquisition just isn't going to cut it. So we got to find something else. Maybe advancement. Sometimes that's how we view our jobs today. We see jobs as a means of advancement or a way to climb the ladder. You know, there's some of us that are wired that way. I'm kind of wired that way. We love that challenge, and we love to excel, and we want to burn the midnight oil, and we're going to do what it takes to climb the ladder and get the promotion and get the raise and climb to this higher echelon of our jobs and our careers and our fields. What about that? Will that satisfy? Ecclesiastes has something to say about that as well. We look at chapter 2, verse 22. It says, "What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain, and even at night, their minds do not rest. And this too is meaningless." The author reminds us that there's always a cost to advancement. What do people get for all their anxious striving and toil, he asks. You got to put something in if you want to get that advancement, if you want to get that return. Sometimes it's time. We got to put in that time. We got to work late. We got to work long. We got to put in the hours. Sometimes it's energy. We got to work like a dog with every ounce of our energy and every drop of our sweat to climb that ladder. Sometimes it comes at the cost of our relationships. And there are baseball games and birthdays that we just can't make because we got to be at work. We got to climb that ladder so that we can excel. And even at night, our sleep is stolen away as we fret over the concerns and the deadlines and the stressors of what's going on at work because we have to nail it. We have to get it right so that we can advance. Is that really a good enough reason to get up on Monday and go to work? I had a friend growing up. His dad, very successful man. He's an investment broker. And I remember I went over to my friend's house after school one day, and his dad had been at work for hours and hours. He usually got up and went in around 6. And then he came home at 6 for dinner. We sat around the table and we talked about the day. He said, "Jordan, nice to meet you. Glad you could be here," so on and so forth. And then after dinner, he went back to the office. He was there until about 10 or 11 when he came home. And that was a pretty typical day for him. Now, he was great at his job. He was very successful. He had a large house, had a nice collection of nice cars. He had a nice family. The problem was that he wanted to be the best so much that he had to make the sacrifice, and he wasn't there enough to be in that large home or to enjoy those nice cars or to save that nice family. It came at a cost. But he was the best. There's no denying that. The question we have to ask is it worth it? Is the price worth the advancement? Now, I don't want to mislead you, okay? There's nothing wrong with advancement. There's nothing wrong with climbing the ladder and putting in hard work. In fact, Ecclesiastes is going to encourage that in a moment. The question we have to ask is it a good enough reason to get up on Monday and go to work? Is that the purpose? Is that the motivator? Is that going to fulfill us? And Ecclesiastes ultimately reminds us it's kind of meaningless. Here's why. Because you're still going to wind up in a pine box. It doesn't matter if you're the president of the company or the lowest man in the mailroom. You're both going to wind up in the same place, and within one generation, nobody will remember or care how high you climbed. It's a depressing book, right? But I want to remind, once again, this is written from the perspective of somebody who has taken God out of the equation and who has asked himself, can I live my life without God laying claim to my desires, to my heart, to my mind? Can I just live life merely under the sun? And the answer he's finding again and again is no. And there's a reason for that. If we were to look at the book of Acts in chapter 17, we find this scene where the Apostle Paul, he's preaching in the city of Athens. It's a city just steeped in philosophy and wisdom. It was like the academic center of the ancient world. And he's preaching before these people, and he says something in this sermon that we need to hear today. He's speaking of God. He says, "In him we live and move and have our being." And he's saying something pretty profound there. In God we live. We exist because of God. He's our creator. In him we move. We continue to exist. We are sustained because God is the sustainer. And in him we have our being. We have significance and purpose and reason because of God, because he declares it and he gifts it to us. God is the reason for significance. And when we try to live our lives merely under the sun, when we take that source of significance out of the equation, what we're left with is this gaping God-shaped void that we have to fill with something. But nothing is going to quite fill it or satisfy. Acquisition is meaningless. Advancement is pointless because it all leaves us destitute at the end. That's where this book is coming from. There is something, though, that does give satisfaction, and there's something that does bless us with contentment. And that's where the thought experiment of Ecclesiastes eventually leads us. If you want a part of your life to have significance, you have to allow God to lay claim to it. You have to allow him to become a part of it, invite him in to bring that significance and to bring that value and that purpose. Let's look at what he has to say as we keep going. In chapter 2, verse 24, he says, "A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. For this too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat and find enjoyment? Now, I just want to point out here that this is the first time, if we were to read this whole book, this is the first time since chapter 1, when he started this little thought experiment, that he has made room for God in his life, that he's invited God in to bring significance. Previously, work wasn't making a lot of sense, but now that he brings God into the equation, all of a sudden the light bulbs are coming on. And he says, look, if you want to have a great life, then enjoy the fruits of your labor, eat, drink, and find satisfaction in what you do. And when he says eat and drink, he's not saying go out and get blasted or overconsume or something like that. He's not saying be frivolous and spend all your money. But he is saying enjoy what you produce. You work hard in this life. It's okay to enjoy the fruits of your labor, be that a little or a lot. The recommendation is don't worry about trying to amass more and more. Don't worry about what you don't have. Just enjoy what you do have. Find contentment and satisfaction in that. And find satisfaction in the way you do your job. In the very labor that you give yourself to, find satisfaction. Do it in such a way that you can hold your head high at the end of the day and know that you did well and know that you succeeded to the best of your ability. This is how we find contentment. Here's what's interesting. He's already tried to do this. If we were to read chapter 2, verse 4, he talks about how he built all these palaces and how he planted all these vast gardens and parks. And his own words, he says, I denied my heart nothing. And yet it didn't satisfy. It left him wanting. But now that he's brought God into the equation, all of a sudden those same efforts do satisfy. And they do bring contentment. And he explains why. He says that satisfaction is from the hand of God as well. Satisfaction itself is something God blesses us with. A lot of times when we talk about blessing, we think of it in terms of things or situations. You know, God blessed me with that job, or God blessed me with that house. My wife and I, we were sitting on the couch yesterday. We had a great day. It was my son's birthday party, and he was running around, and my family and her family, we were all in town. So we just had this great day, and we sat down at the end of this great day, and we said, we're just blessed. We got a healthy little boy. We got another little boy that's coming. We got a family that loves us. We got a great marriage. We're just blessed people. That's how we think about blessings sometimes. But Ecclesiastes takes it a step further. He says, the mere fact that you can find and taste satisfaction, that's a gift from God as well. He gives us the ability to find that satisfaction. He explains a little bit more as we keep reading. Look at verse 26. He says, to the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who does please God. And this too is meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. He gives wisdom and knowledge and happiness to those who please him. What's a life that pleases God? It's one that includes him. It's one that invites him in, whether that be through our conduct or our worship or our labors. When we make space for God, we make space for contentment and satisfaction. He is the reason, by the way, remember, in him we live and move and have our being. If you want part of your life to be satisfying, invite the source of satisfaction into your life. It's simple math. If you want satisfaction in part of your life, invite the source of satisfaction into your life. Make room for God. Make him a part of what you do. Invite him to be part of your worship, to be part of your conduct, to be part of your marriage, to be part of your job. Because he wants to be a part of it. Here's my point. I have no other point this morning besides this. God does care about your work. He cares about it immensely. He cares about what you do. He cares about how you do it. He cares about the quality with which we work and labor. He cares about our conduct during that time. He cares immensely about our work because he cares immensely about you and your life. He wants to be involved. And we're going to talk about what that involvement looks like throughout this series. Like I said, next week we're going to talk about work itself and how we are designed and what God's will is when it comes to work. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. Out of one of my favorite passages in Scripture. It's a deeply theological point that has incredibly practical application in our lives. So I hope you can be here next week for that. The week after that, we're going to be talking about worship and work and what they have to do with each other. Because our work, I'll give you the spoiler, our work is worship. You don't just gather on Sunday morning and sing songs. That's not the extent of worship. Our work is worship. And then in the final week, we're going to talk about, just out of the Proverbs, some practical wisdom for how we can taste the fruits of our labor and enjoy our work and find satisfaction and find the blessing in our labor. That's going to be at the end of this series. I hope you can join us and experience all that with us. But I want to leave you with this thought. We worship a God who works. He's always worked. He worked as a creator in Genesis. He worked as a liberator in Exodus. He worked as a carpenter in the Gospels. He worked as a savior through the cross of Jesus. And today he continues to work through the Holy Spirit to reform us, to renew us, and to restore us. Our God works, and his work is significant. It only makes sense that as people created in his image, we also would work, and that our work would be significant. And that significant comes when we invite him in to be a part of our labors. That's my prayer for you. Is tomorrow when you wake up, you won't dread punching the clock, and you won't dread going to work, whether your job is paid or volunteer, by the way. My hope is that when you wake up tomorrow, you will know this is a day that you can worship and that you can labor and that you can serve, and you can actually honestly say, thank God it's Monday. Let me pray for us.